experts. Welcome to the world of the media.
They deserve to be heard. That's who we are.
Who will win the 2020 elections? And this roundtable will be in English because we have the privilege of hosting 3 American professors and experts on politics and elections in the United States. Let me introduce them to you without further ado. Ray LaRaja is professor of political science at University of Massachussetts Amherst. He works on political parties, interest groups, campaign finance, elections, and political participation. He is a co-author with Brian Schaffner and Jesse Rhodes of Hometown Inequality, Race, Class, and Representation in American Local Politics. The book was published in 2020. Good afternoon, Ray. We're going to talk in a bit. Jennifer Nicoll Victor is an associate professor of political science at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. She studies the U.S. Congress, legislative organization and behavior, social network methods, political parties, and campaign finance. And she is a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Political Networks. Good afternoon, Jennifer.
Great to be here.
Alan Abramowitz is a professor of political science at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He works on American politics, political parties, elections, and voting behavior. And he has published books on American politics, such as The Great Alignment, Race, Party Transformation, and the Rise of Donald Trump in 2018, The Polarized Public in 2012, and the Disappearing Center in 2010. Ray, Jennifer, Alan, thank you so much for being with us today. It's good to see you. And today's activity is a roundtable discussion. So I'm going to go around the table twice and ask you one individual question in each round. But do not hesitate to intervene at any time if you want to add to what your colleagues will say. So I'd like to start with a question for Alan. Alan, earlier this month, you contributed an article to a symposium titled Forecasting the 2020 Presidential Elections. Right. This was published by Political Science and Politics. And if you look at the symposium, you see that some models predict a Joe Biden victory, other models predict a Donald Trump victory. Can you tell us about your model and who has the best chance of winning the election according to it?
Sure, I'll be glad to talk about it. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to the webinar. Very delighted to be here with this outstanding panel. So yes, the 2020 presidential election, I think, presents some unique challenges when it comes to political forecasting. We're facing some unusual circumstances here, some very unusual circumstances. One of them, of course, is that we're going through this pandemic that's had such a devastating impact on our society and on the economy. And it's you know, we have to try to figure out how to factor that into this. It means, I think, that we can't rely on some of the usual indicators that we often do rely on to make our forecasts, such as the state of the economy. Normally, almost all of these sort of political science forecasts include some sort of measure of economic conditions, along with other measures of election fundamentals to try to predict the outcome at least several weeks before the election takes place. This year, if we rely on that traditional measure or any of the traditional measures of economic conditions, we find that the downturn caused by the pandemic, which was deliberately induced to try to control the pandemic, means that the economic indicators are far more negative than any that we've seen in the last 50 or 60 years. And you end up with, I think, an unrealistic forecast. So I've had to revise my time for change model by removing essentially the economy and also by changing my understanding of the way that incumbency plays out in the election. Normally, a first-term incumbent president like Donald Trump has a significant advantage. As a result of rising partisan polarization, and also because Trump himself seems to violate the sort of normal rules of engagement for incumbents, which state that, you know, what you should be trying to do is expanding your electoral coalition, especially if you had a very close win the first time. what I'm looking at here and the model that I presented at the American Political Science Association meeting and in the article is an extraordinarily simplified one that uses one predictor, which is simply the incumbent president's approval rating, both in mid-year in late June and then again in October to try to predict the electoral vote for the incumbent. What I found was that the approval rating itself, the net approval rating, is a pretty accurate predictor of the outcome of the election. And that's especially true when it's measured in October, shortly before the election. And so based on that, I made a forecast in late June that Biden was likely to win the election. At that time, I predicted he would get about 319 electoral votes to 219 for Trump. I'm predicting the electoral vote this time because obviously we've learned that you can't just rely on the popular vote to determine the outcome. And now in October, I can revise that based on the sort of updated model with the October approval ratings. And at this point, with Trump's approval rating still being pretty far underwater, it's about minus 12 right now. That predicts that Biden will actually win by a somewhat bigger margin with about 350 electoral votes. And that the probability of a Biden victory has increased from about 70% now to about 86%. So that's actually pretty much in line with the 538 forecast based on a far more complicated algorithm. And it's also in line with what you find if you just look at the polling averages right now at the state level and aggregate them to the national forecast. So I'm feeling pretty good about that forecast. There is always a margin of error and a degree of uncertainty. So we can't be 100% sure, but I think right now, with a week to go, we're looking at a strong likelihood that Donald Trump is going to be defeated.
Thank you, Alan. Let's talk a bit about money and elections as well, because it seems like Joe Biden has an advantage on this also. Ray, I want to ask you a question about this. You've been working for many years on the role of money in elections and campaigns. Earlier this month, the Center for Responsive Politics projected that, quote, the total cost of the 2020 election will approach $11 billion. That's more than 50% pricier than the 2016 contest. I want to ask you, why is this election so expensive? Is it a continuation or a change from what you've described in your research? And who wins the money race this year? Is it Biden? And if it's Biden, why is it so?
First, let me thank you, Frédérick, for inviting me to this webinar by the Chair Raoul-Dandurand at UQAM. I appreciate it. Delighted to be here. Well, okay, about money. The stakes seem incredibly high for both parties in the country. So the Democrats, they not only disdain the president and the Republican leadership, but they see him as causing an existential crisis for the nation. So on the Republican side, there's also the fear of a Democratic takeover, and all that implies for a backlash on economic regulation, dealing with climate change, fears of Christian conservatives. This might come up later in our talk about their status under the Democrats and liberals, the threat of a multiracial coalition dominating American politics. But despite a pandemic and an economic crisis, it's been very easy to raise money. Now, keep in mind, some of the totals you mentioned, that $11 billion figure, come from self-financed billionaires. We've had a couple of them. Bloomberg spent over $1 billion in his campaign to win the Democratic nomination. He won 55 delegates out of about 4,000. That's about 18 million per delegate. The other billionaire, Steyer, spent almost 500 million. So there are billionaires in that race. The real story actually is in the Senate and House races, where the Democrats have outraised Republicans in nearly all the top races. Some have been powered by Democratic small donors who give impulsively with each Trump tweet, and or focusing events like when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. Much of this small donor money is funneled to campaigns through Act Blue. For those of you who don't know, that's a platform that links donors to Democratic campaigns. And Act Blue says that 13 million people have donated during this cycle, with an average donation of about $35. So, and just in between July and September, it raised 1.5 billion. So small donors count for, according to Open Secrets, 22% of money, compared to 14% in 2016. But I'm quick to point out that American elections are also increasingly powered at the top end by individual super wealthy donors. They give to super PACs, outside groups that raise money and spend it without constraint. Strangely, the traditional corporate PACs are not that involved. They're still there, but they used to be the bane of the campaign finance system, but they are waning in power relative to these groups. So you asked about Biden. He's got a substantial lead. Unusual for an incumbent president not to have a lead, to be losing. But money matters less in presidential campaigns because the candidates also get a lot of media attention. Biden's raised about $1.5 billion, 1/3 for super PACs. Big tech is jumping on this gravy train. Silicon Valley executives have been very active. Of course, they fear regulations. And then there's Bloomberg himself, who's spending $100 million alone in Florida. And I just heard he's spending $10 million in
Texas. Yeah.
So Trump still, but notably, Trump still outperforms Biden with small donors, raising $250 million from them compared to about $200 million for Biden, which was better than Clinton. So Biden right now has a lot more cash in the bank. Trump's cutting back on TV ads in a lot of states, while Biden is expanding the terrain in places where Democrats usually don't win. And in fact, in the crucial states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Biden has outspent Trump by more than 4-1 in this past month. So let me say a few words about the Senate, and then I'll close up. The Senate is where things are truly extraordinary. Senate, they're raising more money than they could spend. They can't spend it fast enough. So this is happening in Maine, South Carolina, Arizona, Iowa. The challenger in South Carolina, Jaime Harrison, his fundraising cycle is at $110 million. It's unbelievable. Even in the American context, that's unbelievable. Much of this money is coming from women from around the country. They now average about 43% of all donors to Democratic candidates, compared to 28% for Republicans. They've given $1.8 billion already, women, much more than when there was a woman on the Democratic ballot in 2016. In the House, there's 24 competitive seats that even some that Trump won easily in those districts, the spending margins for Democrats are way over. I can go through a list, but I won't. But to sum up, in terms of trends, we see both an increase in small donor giving and an acceleration of this kind of independent, some people call dark money or super PAC spending from these groups by wealthy donors. And the trends are increasing every year, and this is no different. And on the Democratic side, I don't see any complaints about too much money in politics this year. I will note that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ray. We'll have a chance to come back to this maybe later during the webinar. Turnout will also be important in this election. Experts often say that turnout is the key to presidential elections. A few days ago, Jennifer, you brought to my attention that voter turnout could break records this year, and that we could approach 160 million voters. That's nearly 30 million more than in 2016. How might this affect the outcome of the election, and which candidate will benefit most from such a high turnout?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here, and it's hard to say exactly what it tells us about democracy. It seems obvious to say that elections are won on turnout. Of course, that's a plain statement to make. But when we're living in this very hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized environment, and each side is motivated to get their own base or their own voters out. And so under such conditions, there are a shrinking portion of the electorate who are perhaps persuadable. And so this is where a lot of groups and candidates and parties are putting resources into turnout rather than persuasion. So I think that's some of what's going on with the money effect. And I had another point that I hope you'll ask about later that I wanted to follow up with something that Ray just said about outside spending, because I saw a stat the other day that blew my mind away. But still on turnout, I'll answer the question that was asked. So in 2016, we had around 138 or 39 million voters, and it was about 60% turnout, which compared to a lot of other Western democracies is on the low side. The United States has had low-ish voter turnout compared to lots of countries. And we could talk about why that might be, but one way to think about it is in democracies where it feels very stable and very sort of old, in some ways, it doesn't motivate people to participate as much. And in the United States, voting is quite costly. Voting administration is very decentralized. We don't hold national elections in the United States. We hold thousands of simultaneous local elections at the same time, all with different ballots and different rules and different administrations and so forth. That means that if you move or change addresses or change names or something, it's complicated to vote. You have to register and make sure your registration is up to date and all of this. And so one of the, it turns out, sort of happy parts of the pandemic has been that because people were being conscious of not wanting to force people to go into a crowded, enclosed space on election day, many states went to great lengths to change their voting rules for the 2020 election to make it easier for people to vote. And it turns out when you make it easier for people to vote, more people tend to vote. So some of what we're observing is simply that. It's simply the easing of more early voting, easing of registration rules and so forth that is causing an increase in turnout. The other thing that I think is going on is this negative partisanship effect that Alan has written quite a bit about. As polarization increases and the parties get further apart, it makes each side feel like a loss is really horrible. So the cost of losing rises as parties get further apart. And so that can drive an interest in turnout in a way that I think we are definitely seeing on both sides. I tend to agree with, sort of picking up on some of the points of evidence that have been brought up already, looking at polls and campaign finance and media hits and so forth, that in general, it seems like Democratic candidates are getting more of an advantage from all of that turnout enthusiasm this year than Republicans are. But we still have to wait and see how all the numbers come in, but that certainly is what it looks like so far. If we had 60% turnout in 2020, we'd wind up with about 144 million voters. The estimates are, it's hard to know exactly how many eligible voters there are in the United States. These are not just the population that's over 18 who are citizens, because there are some former felons who are disenfranchised and things like that. But it's estimated that there are about 240 million eligible voters in the United States. And so if we have the same level of turnout as we had in 2016, we'd wind up with 144 million, which is a lot, but I think that's probably on the low side. And my reasoning for that is looking at the last midterm election. In 2018, the turnout was phenomenal for a midterm election. Yeah, we usually get, maybe 30 or 40% turnout in a midterm election. And in 2018, we had 50% turnout. It was about 14 percentage points higher than the previous midterm election. And so, one way to look at that might be to say, well, should we expect a 14 percentage point increase in turnout in the presidential election? And that's probably too much. Like a 74% turnout rate is probably higher than we should expect. And maybe something in the 5 to 10% range is more reasonable. But it does seem like turnout will be very high this year. And so the question, I think, for political analysts going forward is, what does that mean? What do we take away from this increase in turnout? Because I think you can tell two very compelling stories. On the one hand, it's very good for democracy when people participate. You literally can't have a democracy without elections, and more people out there and more people participating is part of how a system of self-governance is supposed to work by design. So by that view, it's very good. On the other hand, there's evidence to suggest that the reason many people are voting and motivated to vote is because they fear the instability of the system and they fear the other side winning. And that to me says something unsettling about the sort of the robustness and status of the democratic system in the United States. So I'm both heartened and disheartened by the high turnout numbers, and I think I have sort of complex feelings about what it tells us about the status of democracy.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think I want to ask Alan and Ray. You wanted to add something?
Well, no,
please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the questions I have. I mean, that's Jennifer's presentation provided for me was, I wonder if Trump hurt himself by pushing not having mail-in voting, because if I was a Democrat, I'd be happy because I would be able to bank my votes early, make sure people get to the polls. And it's never clear that on election day, right, that people are going to show up. And it's created
Or the
confusion.
lines could be very long too.
Exactly, the lines as well. I mean, I don't know if Alan or Jennifer have anything to say to that, but certainly in the down ballot races, I think it's going to have some impact.
Well, I was going to add something about the trends that we're seeing in early voting. And this is consistent with the story that Jennifer was just telling about the heightened level of interest and motivation to turn out and vote this year. And the fact that states have indeed changed their voting rules to make it easier for people to vote by mail, to vote absentee, and also expanded their in-person early voting locations and hours. And the result of that is that we've already had well over 60 million people voting already in this election, which is far, far greater than we've ever had in the early voting period. And there's still several days left of early voting. In most states, the early voting runs through the end of this week. And we may very well hit well over 70 million votes cast just in the early voting. Most of that is mail voting, is absentee voting by mail, the kind that the president has railed against. And the rest, but there's a good number of people voting in person as well during the early voting. So I think that is another indication that we're likely to see a record turnout for a presidential election in the modern era. And this year, 65 to 70%, I think, is a reasonable prediction of where we're going to end up. And Democrats are voting heavily in the early voting period. In states where there is party registration, you can track, who's voting, and the data show that for the most part, Democrats are the ones who are turning out to vote early or voting absentee, and Republicans are more inclined to vote until election day, maybe partly because of the messaging from the president, and that certainly does raise a concern. If you're a Republican strategist, I think you would be worried about what will happen on election day, given all the problems that can arise, and just perhaps a decline in motivation to turn out and vote based on predictions that the president is likely to lose the election.
Since we're talking about voters, I want to start the second round of questions with a question for Alan, and you can all answer the question. So please feel free to have a discussion about that. But among the electorates that have been the focus of much of the polling and media coverage of this election, we talk about white suburban women, we talk about young voters, African-American voters. Which ones of these groups could make a difference this year? Which one of these groups should we watch on election day and after November 3rd?
Well, I'm not trying to evade the question, but I'm actually going to say all of the above to some degree. I mean, I think that what I'm seeing in the polling data so far is that there's a swing toward Biden compared with 2016 among just about all of these groups. Now African-American voters voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but their turnout was somewhat lower than it had been in 2008 and 2012 with Obama running. So there, I think the key is going to be what the African-American turnout is. The Latino electorate is growing rapidly also, and the turnout and just how democratic that vote is will be crucial. Particularly in a number of swing states. So Arizona is a state with a growing Latino vote. And if they turn out and vote heavily for Biden, he has a pretty good chance, I think, of winning that state. Florida, obviously another swing state with a large but somewhat different, Latino vote. So I'd be watching those. The group that might be the most interesting to look at in this election, though, two groups, I'd say, white college graduates, especially women, who have been trending Democratic, to see just how big a margin can Joe Biden pull from those white college-educated voters, a group that at one time was staunchly Republican, but has been trending Democratic. And the other is the group that has been Trump's base, and that is the non-college white vote. Non-college white voters voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump 4 years ago. They were a group that's been trending Republican for a long time, but they shifted even more toward Trump in 2016. There's some indication that we're seeing a reversal, at least a modest reversal of that trend this year. And that Trump's margins, he's still winning those non-college white voters by a pretty good margin, but maybe not as big a margin as he did 4 years ago. And that could really be crucial in 3 states that I would watch very, very closely on election night, although we may not know the results in all of them until later. And these are really the 3 states that gave Donald Trump the presidency in 2016, because he won all of them by extremely close margins. And those are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And those states have a higher percentage of non-college white voters than the nation. And those non-college white voters really pushed Donald Trump over the top in 2016. If we see a movement away from Trump in 2020 among that voting group in those states, I think that that is very significant.
Jennifer, Ray, do you want to add something? Or I want to ask you to maybe a short question right now. Which states will you be watching on November 3rd? The same states as Alan, or additional states, other states?
Well, the first state I'm going to be watching is Florida. Not only is Florida one of these sort of pivotal states that often is really crucial for a candidate to win. It's hard to win the presidency without winning Florida, particularly for Republicans. The states that are sort of already in the bag for each of the parties, if a Republican candidate doesn't win Florida, he's got a much more difficult path to the presidency. But Florida is also a state that tends to, its polls close on the early side, they're East Coast time, and they're likely to get their vote in relatively early. So before the evening has gone too late, we may know the outcome of the election based on Florida. If Biden has won Florida, despite the fact that many polls are still open and many ballots are to still be counted, many analysts will start thinking that Biden has won the election. And we're just waiting for all the results to come in to say it finally. But if Florida is too close to call, or if Florida goes to Trump, then that it'll tell us that we're going to have to wait quite a bit longer, perhaps into the morning hours or afternoon of Wednesday before we really know the outcome.
I quite agree with Jennifer and Alan. And the other state I'm going to be looking at is Pennsylvania, for some of the reasons Alan's talking about. Do we see a shift in some of those non-college educated white voters that will portend a shift in the Midwestern states that Trump won? And I'll also look at Arizona to see, are we starting to look at a landslide? Because if he wins solidly there. So those are some of the places I'll be looking at.
I would add to that particular counties in Texas, counties that perhaps Trump won in 2016, that if they start going Democratic, which makes Texas look more close, like it's going to be closer, or either a narrow victory for Trump, or potentially the people are even talking about Texas going to Biden now, which seems unlikely. There is also a Senate race in Texas that's pretty likely to go for the Republican. But still, Texas being, on the cusp of the election, here talking about states like Arizona, Texas, and Georgia being competitive, and South Carolina, that's a favorable state for Democratic candidates, because those are the places where we often think of Republicans as having a stronger base.
Yeah, I want to nominate one more state to watch.
Go ahead.
On election night, and that's Georgia, where I am right now.
Do you think it could flip?
I think it's possible that it will, yes. What we're seeing right now in the polling in Georgia is that the presidential race is neck and neck. If you take just the average of the polls that have been done in the past 3 or 4 weeks in Georgia, you come up with just about a dead heat between Trump and Biden. And we also have 2 competitive Senate elections, not 1, but 2. And not only that, but either one or both of those Senate elections could go to a runoff in January. So Georgia has unique election rules, which mean if in the Senate election, if no candidate wins a majority of the vote in November on election day, then there will be a runoff between the top 2 candidates in early January. And we could end up with 2 runoffs, because the second Senate race in Georgia is a special election which uses different rules. It's called a jungle primary, and there are 20 candidates running in that race, but really 3 major candidates, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And so in all likelihood, we're going to end up with a runoff between the leading Democrat, whose name is Raphael Warnock, and one of the 2 leading Republicans, the incumbent Kelly Loeffler, who's facing a very tough battle to get into the runoff against another very conservative Republican named Doug Collins. And so Georgia could end up with 2 runoff elections, and it's possible that those could end up being crucial for determining which party controls the U.S. Senate, which is almost as important as who controls the White House. I'm going to say that, having control of the Senate would make a huge difference to a Biden presidency. If the Democrats don't have the Senate, if Republicans keep control of the Senate, even if Biden wins the presidency, they're going to stymie him. He's going to have a really tough time getting any of his agenda enacted, getting his appointments confirmed. So watch the Senate races really closely. There are, I believe, 22 Republican seats up this year, 13 Democratic seats, and Democrats are hoping they can net at least 3, which would give them a 50-50 split, which would allow Vice President Harris to break the tie. They need at least 3, and they're likely to lose the seat in Alabama, which was sort of a quirk that they won that in a special election. So watch those Senate races. The Democrats will keep the House almost certainly, but the Senate is very much in play.
Jennifer, I want to go back to you. We were talking about Georgia a few seconds ago, and in recent cycles, many states like Georgia have been the scene of tactics to suppress the vote in the hope of helping one party over another. What can we expect this year in this regard? Is it an exaggeration to think that vote suppression could tip the election or the vote in a few states in a different direction than what the polls are showing at the moment?
Well, I do think it's an important topic for observers to keep their eye on, whether you're talking about journalists or students or academics or whatnot, any effort to stop vote counting or prevent people from voting or intimidate people from going to the polls and so forth. These are anti-democratic efforts that require some level of transparency to some extent to help combat. And we've already seen some evidence of some of this type of stuff going on. And so to that extent, I do think it's important for us to talk about it and to be vigilant about it, and to develop tactics that include giving people resources and high quality information about how to track their ballot or cure their ballot if there's a problem, or just be aware of what the laws are in their area. That said, the United States has a pretty strong history of running pretty good elections. And I want to emphasize something I said earlier, which is how decentralized the election administration system is in the United States. Elections aren't administered by the federal government. They're administered by state and county governments. And they're often run by, your neighbors, right? You get all of these local volunteers, and some of who are, you've got election administration experts. But the people who run these local procedures are, they're stickler for rules, and they are very particular about running a system that has some integrity. And so while I do think we need resources and we need support and we need attention to these issues, I have a fair degree of confidence overall in the election administration system, and the fact that it is so decentralized also adds an element of security. It's really hard to hack a system that has thousands of entry points, at least not in a systematic way. So that sense also gives me a little bit more confidence in the system. So will there be errors? Will people find aspects of the voting process that are problematic? Absolutely. Anecdotally, we always find those every year. But the idea that we're going to find some to the extent that it would overturn the election is I'm not going to say impossible, but I think it's unlikely.
Thank you. Ray, I want to go back to you. During the 2020 Democratic primaries, Bernie Sanders' supporters were not particularly enthusiastic about Joe Biden, but it seems like most ended up supporting Biden much more forcefully than Hillary Clinton in 2016. So you have a strange coalition around Biden right now, made up of Bernie Sanders' supporters, but also a significant number of moderate Republican voters. So what is it? Is it a new coalition emerging? Will it be possible for Joe Biden to keep that coalition intact if he's elected? And how will he have to govern to keep it intact if he's elected on November 3rd?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, I'll have to admit. But there's no doubt that fear and loathing of Trump has unified the Democratic factions through this election. But behind the scenes, rest assured, the factions have already begun fighting for position policies. The prospect of these intra-party divisions is very real. There's an impatient left wing of the party and calls for radical change from the Sanders wing. I'm more optimistic, I think, than most about a Democratic coalition holding it together to pass some significant legislation. They benefit from the fact that Republicans are unlikely to make much partisan deal making on the Democrats' agenda. So Biden has to work with the party, and that will pull him a little to the left. He has the benefit of sharing power with a master of congressional leadership, Nancy Pelosi. And if anybody could finesse party divisions, it's her. Her task is less fraught than for Republican speakers who had to deal with the Tea Party, who didn't want anything done. At least the left wing of the party wants something done in the Democratic Party. So there's some opportunities there. The Senate's going to be more challenging. For anything to happen, the Democrats have to win the chamber, or there would just be another standoff that Alan was alluding to with Republican leader Mitch McConnell. Then they have to get rid of the filibuster, depending on how many they have, which is not a certainty because some Democrats actually like it. It protects them from making tough votes. And then there's going to be Senate Democrats from purple and red states in this Congress who may have recently won. They're not going to take big risks on behalf of the progressive wing of the party. So Chuck Schumer probably has the toughest job in this scenario. And he's going to have to work with Biden to tell him what is actually feasible. In terms of the coalition, policies that are related to race are going to be, racial policy is going to be very challenging for a party that's a multiracial coalition, especially if debates start to hinge on issues that have not polled well at all with the broader elected. So if you start talking about things like reparations, defunding the police, that's not going to benefit the coalition. Healthcare, Biden's a staked out a position, which is good. Shore up Obamacare. Do not use a single payer system. The coalition's going to be behind him on that. That's a big thing. And they're going to be behind him on huge infrastructure spending. All Democrats want that. It's going to be very interesting to see how he takes on big tech and Wall Street, which are the big donors to the party. There's going to be more regulating. There's going to be some anti-monopoly stuff that started in this administration. I think that might continue. And most likely raising taxes. And so what are these big donors going to say? They're part of the coalition. So, he has a chance for significant change. He's going to make a symbolic effort to work with Republicans. But unlike Obama, he's not going to try that hard because he knows it's a waste of time. And paradoxically, given who he is, his race, his age, his gender, his moderation, he might actually pass some pretty substantial policy changes. And if he's lucky, he's going to have a Congress behind him. So overall, yes, big infighting in the coalition should Biden win, before he's sworn in, big fighting. And they're going to need to move quickly on programs. And if you keep it in the beginning, first year, and get some successes, that's good. But as the midterm approaches, all bets are off because people in the purple areas are going to start being more conservative and break from that coalition.
Alan?
Yeah. Great answer, Ray. I really agree with just about everything that Ray was saying there. I think the Senate is going to be crucial. It will be very helpful to Biden if he has, say, 52 or 53 votes in the Senate rather than just 50. Because if he has 50 or even 51, keeping all those Democrats in line to vote for a progressive policy agenda. When you were talking about someone like Joe Manchin, who's the most conservative Democrat in the Senate. Now Manchin's been pretty loyal to the party recently. I've been impressed by the fact, for example, he voted against the Supreme Court nominee. He voted for both articles of impeachment. But I don't know if he's going to support some of the kind of energy policies, particularly that that Biden might want to see enacted. There's a sort of a somewhat modified Green New Deal kind of approach. So that'll be very interesting. But what I was going to bring up was the battle is not just going to be on the Democratic side. If Donald Trump loses this election and Republicans get wiped out and lose the Senate and lose more seats in the House, which I think are entirely possible, there's going to be a battle for the future over the future of the Republican Party. Between, and I think it'll boil down to a battle between Trump loyalists and those who want to sort of keep the party moving in that direction, or including perhaps Trump himself. He's not going to disappear if he loses the election, but his supporters, who clearly are dominant within the Republican electoral coalition right now, and those who believe that the party needs to move in a different direction, needs to put Trump in the rearview mirror and move the party in a different direction that's more welcoming and that is and to try to broaden that coalition, the kind of thing that they were talking about after losing the 2012 election, but that never happened. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch what happens with the Republicans for the next couple of years if they lose this election.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely in terms of one thing that I'll just, it's no fun to be on a panel where everybody agrees with one another. So I'll pick a fight just a little bit, in a playful way. But Ray was talking about, the prospects for Biden building a coalition and perhaps being moved a little bit left. Of course, not withholding what might happen in the Senate is a big factor, but assuming that the Senate went Democratic is the world I think we're playing with. Biden has built this reputation for himself as being someone who builds bridges, as being this coalition builder. And one of the things that'll be interesting to watch is whether he tries to build that coalition within his own party and use those sort of, political skills to build that coalition just within the party, or if in fact he leaves off some of the more extreme factions of the Democratic Party and tries to build some bridges with the Republicans. It's hard to envision a political environment. Obama tried to do some of that and it got him absolutely nowhere. I think Joe thinks he is a different person and has different attributes that might give him an edge over Obama there. But I think that sort of remains to be seen. But that's one of the things that I'll be looking for in terms of those post-election coalition buildings. The other thing that I'm going to be interested to see how Democrats prioritize, and I don't know how we started talking about post-election so much, but is I feel like there's two big buckets of goals that are high on the agenda. And one of them are a lot of these policy things that my colleagues have already mentioned about infrastructure and healthcare and environment and so forth. Guns might be on that list as well, and immigration certainly. So there's this high priority laundry list of policy, but there's also a high priority laundry list of institutional change to help shore up some of the weaknesses we've seen in democratic institutions that have befallen in the United States over the last number of years, partly as a result of our polarization. And so whether we see Democrats talking about court reform, I don't think the packing the court idea is going to really be serious in the aftermath of things, but some court reform might be talking about statehoods, DC, Puerto Rico, and other territories. Talking about the Voting Rights Act and really shoring up the ability for the federal government to protect people's right to vote. Talking about making changes to congressional representation. People who are getting serious about polarization and the dysfunction it causes to our legislative politics are talking about things like making congressional districts bigger, making the House of Representatives quite a bit larger, using multi-member districts and moving to ranked choice voting. And a lot of these are big, difficult questions to answer, but I think they're really important conversations for Americans and Democrats, particularly to have, should they have the opportunity to make those moves.
Thank you very much. When I teach American politics in the classroom every week, these days I get a question very often, and the question goes like this. We see that Donald Trump often suggests that he might not recognize the result of a defeat if he loses the election. He has stated that there's a significant risk of voter fraud with mail-in ballots. What are the scenarios if Trump loses but doesn't want to leave the White House? People are kind of worried about this on this side of the border. What happens if it happens?
No, there's good reason to be worried. People on this side of the border are worried about that too. I think that if Biden wins, it's a near certainty that Trump is unlikely to accept that and to either make unsubstantiated claims of fraud or other sorts of improper electoral procedures or something like that, and that he may be unwilling to truly concede the election. A concession, though, isn't anything that is, sort of legally functional. A concession is just sort of the norm that democracies follow for a transition of power period. And so what I'm going to be looking for, if this seems like a relatively likely scenario, it's looking more likely that Biden will win. It's looking more likely that Trump is unlikely to want to accept that. So what we need to be looking for is, how do other Republican leaders respond to Mr. Trump's unwillingness to accept an election outcome? And I think some of that may depend on how the winning happens. How, is it a landslide? Is it an overwhelming loss? That might help some Republicans to get a little bit more humble and help them to send out, elite messaging goes a long way for driving public opinion. And if you get elite Republicans, not Trump himself, I think that's unlikely, but other elite Republicans coming out and saying, we lost and this is how it's going to go, then that would make a big difference in terms of a transition period. But if Trump is out there stirring up supporters and encouraging violence in the streets and protest, protest is fine. There was lots of Democratic protest after 2016. There's nothing wrong with protest. And I think no matter what happens, we're going to see protest. The question is, will it be violent, and who's going to be stirring it up, and what are the asks that the protesters are going to have? Are they regular sort of Democratic practice asks, or are they something that looks much less in line with Democratic norms and values?
Alan?
Yeah, I agree completely we've already sort of gotten some hints from Republican leaders, including Mitch McConnell, that they are not going to go along with Donald Trump if he tries to resist, if he refuses to accept the results of the election. So I'm fairly optimistic that we're not going to see that happening. Now, obviously, it does depend somewhat on the margin. If it's a very close election, and say there are a couple of states that are in doubt, and there are disputes, let's say over counting absentee ballots or things which could happen, and there's court challenges, then I think we could be in for a protracted period of uncertainty, and for all sorts of shenanigans, let's say. On the other hand, if it's a fairly decisive outcome, that becomes clear pretty quickly, I think you will see other Republican leaders moving pretty quickly to accept the results, and I don't think Trump will get much support. Some of this that we're seeing, from Trump, I think people have to remember that Trump is sort of a showman, I think that a lot of his talk about not accepting the results of the election and about massive voter fraud, we've heard this before. He even talked about it after he won the election in 2016. So I don't necessarily take it all that seriously. Obviously, there's always going to have to be some concern about the potential for violence. There are extremist groups out there, and Trump himself has encouraged some of them in the past. And so we could see, efforts but I think they'll be fairly isolated. I'm not expecting any kind of massive uprising from the American public if Trump is defeated. If Trump somehow wins the election against all odds, I think that you're going to see a lot of questions and concerns raised by Democrats, on the other hand, about how did this happen, and about the possibility of tampering, of fraud, of voter suppression. I mean, so it could go in either direction.
Ray, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly. I agree with my colleagues. I also think we should watch Fox News and see how they respond, not just the entertainment side, but the news side, to see if they behave responsibly. And also, Facebook has a role. There's going to be huge circulation of rumors. How are they going to deal with that? They need to have all hands on deck. And then the other, I'll be looking at state legislatures where there's really close election. Are they talking about invalidating their process for choosing electors because of disqualified election? I mean, that starts to raise really big issues for me. I don't see that happening, but those are some things I'll be looking at.
Ray, Alan, Jennifer, thank you so much